Um, Welcome to the April 230th day of the month. Suzanne and Sharon and I are all here, and we have a number of people as well from the school committee and from the advisory committee. So welcome. Our first, why don't we start with since Mary Ellen's not quite here yet. Ben, can you start, or should we? Do we need to wait for her?
I can start. I just don't know what the order of the agenda is, but I'm assuming the FY21 budget is first.
Yeah, why don't we focus on that first?
Great. So let me just pull. So So the documents for folks who aren't on the subcommittee, the documents. I don't know if you can see the chat or not, but I put a link to where the documents are, and I'm going to focus on the really two. There's there's a presentation on the FY21 balanced budget, and there's a summary table of the FY21 balanced budget. I'll show both of those I'll show all that information during the presentation, but just so you know, there are two documents. The subcommittee got those last night. Let me just pull them up and share them with folks. So you can see.
While you're doing that, I just want to let people know that for Town School Partnership and FY20, I just want to make sure Mary Ellen's here for that. But why don't we start with 21? Ben, you're on mute.
Excellent. Have I been on mute the whole time? No. Sorry. So what I was saying was that there's a link in the chat. I don't know if folks can see the chat, but that will send people to where the documents are posted on our website. The subcommittee got them last night. What you should be seeing now is a slide with the title page. See that? Yes?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'll, 1 second here. All right, so what we're going to do today is go through, just give folks a little context. While the school committee and our staff have been working on the budget for a while, it's been a bit since other folks who are on the call and maybe watching have actually seen some of the details. So I'll give you a little bit of background on where we've been and where we are now. A little bit of background on where we've been, and then get you caught up to where we are now. I will say as a preamble, this budget work is really sort of pre-pandemic. So we have a balanced budget in the pre-pandemic world as the current pandemic world sorts itself out financially and fiscally. But we'll talk more about that as we at the end of the presentation. So just in terms of the priorities developed through the budget process, this was shared early on in January. We knew in November we were likely facing a significant gap between our projected costs and our projected revenue. And through a collaborative budget process, we developed a number of priorities. These are also in line with and come from, in part, the school committee's budget priorities they laid out in their budget priority document, which is online. So preserve Brookline's robust, well-rounded learning experiences for our students, pre-K through 12, including our program, service, and support. So this was, in Brookline, we offer a tremendous amount of opportunities, programs, services, supports to our families, to our students and families, and wanted to do everything we could to preserve those. We've done an excellent job of doing that in this budget at this point. Preserve the integrity of the instructional environment. So, limit as much as possible any impact on the classroom. Adjust staffing programs and services based on the situation at each school as part of an annual assessment of what is needed in the upcoming year. With year after year significantly increased funding from 2 successive overrides, Brookline was able to get away or moved away really from an annual assessment of what's working, what's not working, where do we need to adjust based on needs or students or that sort of thing, because we were adding and we were doing that because our enrollment kept on going up, and our funding was also, the town was supporting us in a very significant way. So this year really signals back to a regular assessment of what is needed in the upcoming year and making adjustments. The next bullet really is similar in some ways. but the idea of live within our means by foregoing adding new positions. We've been adding new positions at a remarkable clip over the last 5 years, and both because enrollment is leveling off, but also because our funding isn't what we expected it to be a couple years ago. You'll see that we continue to recommend not adding new positions. Identifying cost savings through targeted adjustments. So this is really in line with the third bullet, that each year we should adjust staffing, program, services based on the students who are going to be there, their identified needs, and also the needs of the schools, that sort of thing. And then we also had hoped to do a couple of things that were new or additive, including strengthened emotional and behavioral support we provide our students in pre-K through 12. That and any other additions are seeming unlikely at this point. Second here. So budget challenges. This is really sort of a reminder to folks. PSB is getting lower than expected revenue from the 2018 override, and that compounded the effect of what we knew was a coming deficit, coming gap because of our structural deficit, and that includes the ongoing rise of mandatory costs outpacing the increase in revenue. So we anticipated that a couple of years ago in the third year of the override, which FY21 is the third year of the override. And then with revenues being even lower than projected, that widened the gap. Our ongoing increase in personnel costs as a result of adding 237 full-time equivalent staff since FY 2016. All of our staff continue to outpace the increases in staff costs, continue to outpace our increase in revenue or available funds to spend. And we've had recently larger than expected year-over-year increases in mandated services, including out-of-district tuition and special education transportation costs. And that resulted really in a 3.6 or actually 3.8 million total gap between projected expenses and revenue. So the structural deficit this year is playing out in that size gap of projected expenses and anticipated revenue. And we'll show you how we dealt with that. This is the budget development history. So you see in the column on the left here, FY20 STEM, that's our existing budget in FY20. The override plan, the original override plan from 2018. That's what we anticipated we have. And then you see just the development as we went along, and that was in this middle column here. FY21 plan adjusting 1229. That was just sort of in the depths of budget development, and that was when we were being very conservative in our projections of our costs, meaning being conservative in the sense that every possible cost we could use or develop, and that's what we and then also those are the most conservative projections on revenue. You have the most conservative projections on revenue and the most sort of and all possible expenditures including moving forward previous cuts. That's why we had at that point a paper gap of $4.2 million. As the revenue picture became clearer and increased and sort of improved some in January, and as we honed our projected expenses, you saw this gap come down to 2.8, and then we were able to reduce that by the time I came public on January 30th by identifying decreases in projected spending and some adjustments in revenue from the town and other sources. I was able to present a budget that at that point, at the end of January, had a gap of only $251,000. And this is where we are now. So the first three columns you saw on the previous slide. What happened in February is we had to increase, the gap actually increased by about $1 million from 2 point, because we included at that point additional requests from one additional request, significant one from the building department for ongoing maintenance. So addition to what they were already requesting. We also included at that point obligations that we anticipate from the Student Opportunity Act, and also a Title I revision. We're expecting our Title I grant to go down. At that point, The $1.26 million gap is where we've been operating for the last couple of months or so, while we've worked through the school committee and also really dealt with the pandemic. And that sort of slowed the budget process now. What I'm showing you today is the orange column, and that shows a $89,000 surplus on paper because of adjustments we made over the past month or so. So that's where we are now. This is a quick summary of where we have been, where we are now, and then I'll go into details now about what we had to do to get to an $89,000 surplus. That is in air quotes. We're closing that projected gap. So from the beginning, one of our main areas, I said before, is identify limited and targeted adjustments rather than wide-scale cutting of staff, programs, or services. So rather than lopping off, a hand or something like that, and finding big chunks of cost reductions by reducing services across the board or eliminating large sort of chunks of staff, we've been looking across the board for fractional adjustments and have been able to do quite a good job of that. So instead of getting rid of all paraprofessionals in a certain grade, or instead of getting rid of a program like world language in K-2 or K-5, which would have made big advancements towards reducing this gap. Instead, we identified cuts that could happen from across the board in much smaller ways, which would have little to no impact. So in January, just to summarize this, we went from a $2.8 million gap to $251,000. I've already described how we went from in February, $251,000 gap to 1.2, and then I'll show you today how we balanced the budget by identifying 1.35 million in cost savings in the past couple of months. So January, again, this is partly a reminder for folks, but also go into a little more detail than we have. So this is what we did in January. Try to living within our means by foregoing adding new positions, and so we reduced the planned growth of a new staff. Those are primarily at the high school. So these are not staff we have. These are staff we were expecting to, or hoping to, or planning to add at the high school level for the most part, because we projected at that point in 2018 much higher enrollment increases at the high school. In January, to get down from $2.8 million gap to $251,000, we also continued a reduction in supplies and materials that we did last year, and so we brought that forward. So that's $600,000. And then we also, in January, were able to refine our special education, tuition, and transportation projections. So we reduced anticipated spending. We reduced anticipated spending not by having any actual spending cuts, but just by getting better information, as we always do, than we had in November and December. In November and December, we were projecting our cost in these two areas to be quite a bit higher than they've turned out to be, in FY21. And then we also made adjustment in terms of the town-school partnership on number 4 there. So I want to go into the number 1 here because folks have asked a number of questions about why we would cut, or why we would not pursue or go forward with planned additions at the high school. And there are a couple of different reasons for this. One is we've added significant staff at the high school over the last 5 years, 24.5 educators and two school leaders. And so those have been really added in anticipation as increases in the so as you'll see, some actually minor increases, or not minor, but relatively small increases at the high school have happened. And so we feel at this point for next year, with the budget situation as it's going to be, that it doesn't make sense at this point to add even more staff, particularly when the enrollment looks like this. So just going back, so this slide, the first column here is the data we were using during override planning 2018. As you can see, so that was at FY18 is when we were doing the planning, and the actual numbers at that point were 2,044. We projected them to go up to next year to 2,255, and then continue a pretty significant, rapid increase up to 2,500 by FY25. So with these projections, it made sense more than 2 years ago, or I guess 2 years ago, to plan for a larger increase in staff in FY21. The actual enrollment, as you can see in this next column, went from 1,933 students to 2,064 this year, really only an increase of 130 students over 5 years, while we've been adding 24 new staff. And then what happens going forward is the projections, as most folks know, are, while they continue to increase at the high school, not as quickly as we thought. And you can see we've got 2 projections now, 2 forecasts, one from Cropper McKibben, one from MSBA. And you can see that both of them are projecting, a couple hundred fewer students in the upcoming years at the high school. I do appreciate this might change over time because of the pandemic, but it's hard for us to justify when we're trying to find, a few $1 million of reductions, adding staff that at this point the high school doesn't appear to need. Of course, they would like more staff. Schools always would like more staff, but in difficult times like this, it's not always feasible. And we would much prefer to preserve existing staff, existing programs, existing services, because of course, if we added staff to high school, those dollars would have to be taken from somewhere else. So it's hard for me to rationalize adding staff that don't appear to be necessary, or I should say essential, at this point at the high school, when we'd have to find similar cuts of existing program staff services that are working with students today. So that's a little more detail on what it amounts to a real shift, a significant shift in spending from planned additions at the high school to preserving other programs and services. So then what we did in April, so there are 2 slides here. So we've adjusted staffing, programs, and services based on part of the annual assessment of what our needs are in the upcoming year. So again, professional development, this has been funded. This is a second district-wide professional development day. It's been funded for the last few years, but not used. So we're cutting that. We're consolidating small classes. I actually had 4 schools on upper elementary and middle grades at Lawrence, CCS, Pierce, and Heath. Special education staff will be reduced in a number of places, sort of fractional adjustments based on changes in services, students not needing services anymore, or different approaches in terms of staffing from the elementary schools into the high school as kids age up. And also we'll eliminate a internship program that has proved to be complicated and messy in terms of staffing and providing and provisioning and managing, and also with limited impact as far as we can tell. And then the last couple pieces here, we identified cost savings through targeted adjustments rather than across the board cuts, as I was explaining. And you'll see these are happening in sort of fractional pieces in a variety of schools. So there's no place, you see the examples we're using here, visual arts 0.5 FTE. That's happening 0.1 at a couple schools, 0.2 at other schools. It isn't reducing any one person by that amount. I'll talk more about how we're approaching these staff adjustments and reductions in a little bit. And then another way we reduced our anticipated costs was foregoing the building department's additional recommendations for additional maintenance. So we are transferring money, as part of the town school partnership for ongoing maintenance. But the building department requested additional funding for HVAC, specifically for HVAC repair and maintenance. And the subcommittee recommended not pursuing that. So that was another way we found a significant chunk of savings. This is just a summary table of what I just had in the previous slides. So you can just see it on one page and see the FTEs or personnel costs, supply costs related to each of them. You'll see the total FTEs is 11.5 here. I'll talk about that in one moment. Folks, a chance to look at that. So just a quick summary of identified cost savings. I realized I didn't add one of these, but reduction of planned staff additions. So that's the reduction of the planned staff additions at the high school. Professional development, you see a total of $235,000 there. Supplies, $600,000. The internship program, $80,000. Then the existing staff reductions, FTE reductions, is a total of $700,000. What's important to realize is just to help put it in context is the 11.5 FTE is less than 1% of our staff. So at a time when we're trying to find $2-3 million in cost savings, it's not a large cut in staff. And also by some careful planning from our principals and coordinators, the reductions are going to be primarily addressed through staff attrition, retirements, a leave, and just adjusting folks from full-time to part-time. And even those adjustments aren't, we're not recommending someone goes from 1.0 to 0.2 or 0.4. So what we really try to do is be quite strategic about these reductions, and maintain what we have. The adjustments in some of those specials like world language, art, are really focused on where principals have said that they've been, in a sense, overstaffed. They can no students will actually get less math or less art or less world language. The world language, for example, is happening through consolidation of smaller classes. So at one school, there's 2 classes which have about 10 and 12 kids in the 2 classes, and so when you combine them, you get a class size of about 22, which is absolutely in line with the rest of our schools and our rest of our world language classes. But you then also reduce a staff member's FTE by 0.2. 1 second here. So this is just a summary of where we are and the changes year over year. So you saw these numbers earlier, but we're seeing change from FY20, both in dollars and percentages. Give folks a chance to look at that. And then the road ahead. So, yeah, there's an asterisk on the balance, which says interim superintendent balanced budget on the top here. On this title is a red asterisk, and that asterisk is very, very important. Second here. So next steps. First of all, the most important one is the impact of COVID-19 pandemic is likely to severely impact our FY20 budget and require further cuts. So as those folks who were involved in the town school partnership meeting last week, that at this point from the state government and also town, it's too early to tell really what the impact of the pandemic will be on the economy and therefore our state and town receipts and therefore our school funding. Everyone is anticipating it to be significant. On our superintendent's calls recently, Bill Bell, the CFO of the Department of Education, it's mentioned that they're talking about upwards of 10% or more cut in the state budget. That doesn't mean there's a 10% cut in state funding or Chapter 70 funding exactly, because there may be some money from stimulus or a rainy day fund to help ward that off, but it does mean that we are going to face further cuts. And at this point, we don't know when we'll get that information. The legislature is working on it, on a unified budget, and we'll know that in the next month or so. that's the very bad news. The good news, the silver lining, really, in some ways, we were able to, by working with our principals, directors, coordinators, and also getting input from the school committee, to lay out quite a number of a broad set of ideas that where we could identify, further cuts, further cost savings. And so I feel like we've done a lot of the groundwork for whenever we do get final numbers for FY21 to move relatively quickly to identify further savings as needed. Those savings could be, those savings reductions, cuts could be difficult. They'd like to be difficult. I don't want to gloss over that, but I do feel like we've done quite a bit of the legwork and groundwork in order to be able to do that relatively quickly. So just next steps here. Public presentation today at the subcommittee, public presentation at the school committee meeting next week. We've already had the official public hearing on the budget, but this will allow folks on May 14th to give any comments on this final recommendation. And we'll continue obviously in May and June, as I mentioned before, the further planning related to the impacts on the FY21 budget of the pandemic. So let me pause there. Happy to go over slides and add more detail as necessary or answer questions.
Thank you for that. Let me start by just asking if there are anybody on the school. We've had this discussion on the school committee a number of times. So let me just ask quickly if there's anybody who wants to ask any questions from the school committee. I can't see everyone at the same time on my machine. So if there's any school committee members who have a question, just speak up.
Yeah, this is Susan. I have a couple of questions. Could you talk for a minute, Ben, about the social emotional support staff at the high school? I just want to make sure, as we've talked before, that it's so important for our students to have the number of counselors and social workers they need. I just want to make sure we're not taking money away from those programs. And in fact, we might think about whether or not we need an additional FTE or not on that department.
Yeah, so except for what you see here, we're not taking any, what I've just presented, we're not taking positions from any school. We're not, in the past, as you know, we've added every year, but we haven't done that. We're not doing that at all. What we have worked with the high school, at one point, we were working on talking with the high school about having to look closely at historically under-enrolled classes and classes with, in smaller classes, and have them cut those and then not use those savings. Okay, so make real cuts in those. What we'll be working with them on now instead is still doing that work. It makes sense to do that work. If you have a historically under-enrolled class that hasn't been, getting above 15 students or so for a number of years, depending on the circumstances, it probably makes sense to offer something different and use those resources in a different way. And there's also then a number of classes that are just small and can be adjusted to resectioning. What we've talked to the high school about and we'll work with them on is still doing that work, but then reinvesting those savings from those changes, those, limiting those classes into other, they can now certainly reallocate those savings for their own uses. And that's certainly a place where they could choose and should choose to reallocate those resources to social emotional support, maybe that social worker, psychologist, that sort of thing. So we're certainly encouraging them with that. We're providing support as needed on it. But that's really where I'm suggesting and working with Anthony on identifying how can we provide additional support and actually grow it even in a time where we're facing significant cuts.
Okay, thank you. And then I noticed that I didn't hear any conversation about any reductions at central office. Is that on the table, off the table?
Those are certainly on the table. As you know, we've had discussions about them, sort of inconclusive discussions about them. in with the school committee. But those are certainly on the table, and I'd expect that, in our, as I mentioned, we are expecting further cuts, and I expect us to be sort of clear on what can happen on that as we go forward. So definitely.
And then I had one other one. Under a teacher mentoring program, is that a $35,000 savings? It's not 235, right? The 235 is professional development with teacher mentoring.
Yeah, the $200,000 is from the professional development day, and then
Right.
and then 35,000 is the teacher mentoring. And thank you for that question, because the teacher mentoring, we're not eliminating that. We're focusing it. We've been providing mentors for all teachers new to Brookline, even if they're a 10-year teacher or a 15-year teacher, that sort of thing. What we're refocusing that on just teachers who are new to the profession. So our teachers who are in their first 3 years of teaching will still get a mentor and be involved in our mentoring program for those 3 years. It's just really a focusing effort, which is something we need to do. Those teachers who are still new to Brookline typically do get, especially at the high school, they get support through the department typically, and often. And this is less formal, but you'll also often at a chief grade level team have folks supporting folks who are new to Brookline. So that we assume will still.
So thank you for that clarification, because I think it's important that it doesn't appear that we're taking away mentoring from our new teachers. That would, I think, be a mistake. So thank you.
That's great, and I'll adjust that next week so it's clearer. So thank you for that.
On the special education side, could you elaborate a bit more on the 6.4 FTE cut for 314,000 and whether you feel that we can get by making that kind of cut? Because usually the feedback we receive is that special education is an area of tremendous need where we actually need more staff.
Yeah, so I don't think Casey's on here, but it's really looking at kids who are as they get older, what services they need, and a shift in sort of service delivery typically. It also may be students who are moving from one grade to as they get older, don't need paraprofessionals in the way they did before. There's also some administrative cuts there as well. So it's a combination of kids no longer needing services, and this has been done, just so you know, very close look at by led by Casey, but by the directors, by the ETFs, looking closely at and principals as well, at student by student, numbers of students, and those shift year to year. I mean, they can shift, they don't always shift, in terms of what services supports students need, particularly as they get older. And so we would not make a reduction in a way that would impact services to students. We can't do that really, but we certainly can when services or supports are lessened. We do need to make those adjustments year to year. So we're providing, so we aren't providing services or aren't keeping people on when it isn't necessary. So those are, in terms of professional development staff across many buildings, again, those are very targeted cuts, and we are confident that we will continue to, as we always do, meet the support and services that students require.
Okay, any other questions from committee members? Okay, otherwise questions from advisory committee members? Yeah, Cliff, go ahead.
So I don't know if these are all questions, maybe perhaps more comments, and maybe some questions linked in there. I guess my first comment is that while this is all interesting, as I think most people on this call probably know, I find that this is irrelevant, given where the town, the state, the country is right now. And you've got a couple of meetings coming up, making the same presentation to wide audiences that essentially, 10 days or 2 weeks after that, or maybe even before that, you're going to have to come back to people and basically say, well, ignore everything that we just told you. And I think that that's something that you really should consider as to whether or not you want to move forward with. I've got a number of.
Cliff, I just want to respond to that. I agree with you. I mean, that this is the complicated times we live in, right? We do need to be notifying staff, whether it's FTE adjustments or if their position is being cut by May 15th, especially Unit A. And so, and we also need to move forward on scheduling as well for next year. So all of which, of course, is more complicated than it ever has been. So I do agree with you. I mean, it's a conundrum for us. Do we put out information like this and then with the acknowledgement, as I've done here, that we have to change it? So in terms of running our buildings and preparing for next year, I do feel it's important to have this preliminary step of making some decisions at this point on an interim basis. I think there is a good question about whether we just are as public as we are, but I do want folks to understand that we do need to make these decisions now as best we can, so folks can move forward in a variety of ways.
Right. Okay, well, you've raised another point that I assume we get to sooner rather than later, but which really is the May 15th date. And you're now in a situation where school is not reopening this year, which up until a couple of days ago, no one was really quite sure of. And it's unclear whether or not school will open in September. And I am curious at some point to have the conversation to hear from you how you deal with that with staff and this May 15th date. But before you go there, and I'm not suggesting you actually have to answer that today, I do want to make one observation. And that is that over the last probably, 5, 6, 7 years, whenever there's been conversations about budget challenges for the schools and potential cuts being made, it's always been undertaken as some sort of across-the-board adjustment to the entire budget. And all the time we've heard about how this is an increasingly efficient way of doing things, or that these cuts are able to be made without any with little or no impact to the services being delivered. Now this is on top of us being told 6 years ago that there was quote, no fat or waste in the school department. And I'm not suggesting that there was or that there is, but I am wondering, and if I were a parent with kids still in the schools, I'd be wondering how it is that these incremental cuts across the board can continue to happen in an environment where there is no waste without having an impact on the service that's being delivered, as opposed to taking a more targeted approach that doesn't shortchange a little bit everywhere, and tries to address things in a more direct manner. And that might be cutting part of world language. That might I could come up with a few other ideas. You've talked about this year-to-year change, looking at kids in special education who no longer need services. To me, if that's something that happens anyway, then that's really not any new found money. That's something that was going to happen anyway. If it wasn't happening anyway, then something was amiss. And on the margin, if if you're anticipating or you're deciding on the margin that something is no longer needed, whereas you wouldn't have if you weren't required to find savings, that to me, there's a disconnect. I don't quite understand that. So, variety of different comments. Broadly speaking, I think you really should be focusing your time on, coming up with something, not waiting. Newton isn't waiting. They're coming up with a revised budget by the middle of May. I honestly don't understand why Brookline can't do that. I just think that's where your attention should be focused.
Okay, thank you. Got that?
I mean, a couple of thoughts on that, Cliff. I mean, first of all, I think that right now, the educational leadership team is struggling to come up with a distance learning plan. So I think that we need to help them keep their eyes on the prize and make sure that we have a strong, solid plan for the next 8 weeks to close school, to finish out the school year in good shape. So I appreciate your thoughts on how they should be spending more time on the budget, but in my opinion, we need to have very clear learning expectations, and we need an educational vision and a roadmap for landing the rest of this year, which we don't yet have. So I'm not saying we don't need a budget, but we need other things also. Second, I think the work that the superintendent and the deputy superintendent have done to get to this place is important, because if we didn't get here, we can't get to where you're talking about. So I appreciate that this is not all the distance, but I also appreciate the sort of framing comments that this is part of the distance and we need to keep finishing the distance. I will say that, this is a mix, as you noted, of cuts that needed to happen anyway and would happen anyway, things which I would just consider savings or efficiencies, things that we wouldn't necessarily do if we didn't have to, like reducing the number of choices at the high school for electives, or reducing, the availability of certain types of classes for our students, or by consolidating, sections and in the middle grade. So there are definitely some things in here that we wouldn't do if we didn't have to. And then there are a set of things in here which are actually already starting, and I appreciate Ben's thoughts on how, it's the goal was to minimize the effect on current staff members. But I think the other piece of this is that there are a number of things that, we know our needs that are not getting met in this budget. So for example, just the social emotional piece, there have been discussions for many, many months about increasing the emotional and behavioral supports. That's been one of the number one issues we've heard from teachers. And from building principals is the level of needs going up in that area, and we are not increasing that. So of course it's not, this is not a time to quote unquote add new things. At the same time, we have already seen, and this is pre-COVID, those needs going up, and we are not increasing those funds. So I think it's sort of a mix in here, and maybe there's something we can do, which is slightly better job of sort of saying, here are the ones that are every year efficiencies. We should just take them, with students are aging, high cost students, high need students are aging out, and we can redeploy those resources. We should just do that every year. If there are historically under enrolled classes, we should, do that every year. However, there are a number of things in here that are not that, let alone sort of new things. And just to the high school project, in particular, so if we're not adding the 10 new staff this year for all of the reasons that Ben outlined, there are also things that are changing on that project. So if we're needing to plan for a third year at the old Lincoln School, and we're needing to plan it with this year's 7th graders, that's quite big. There are going to be additional costs associated with that are not in this current budget here, let alone sort of what I would call COVID catch-up costs, which I would assume are going to impact the high school more, but doesn't necessarily, but maybe not, but everything from, MCAS graduation requirements to AP exams to college supports and all kinds of things that are going to come up at the high school on the other side of this, in addition to the things that are coming up on the K-8. So I guess all I would say is that, there's sort of a lot going on in this budget, and I think we have to kind of take it in phases, and keep an eye on, not getting too excited and comfortable with this budget, but recognizing that that more is going to be needed.
But all those comments are very fair, Susan. And I'm obviously just reacting to what I'm hearing, but to a certain extent, what you just said tends to reinforce at least one of my comments, which is this across the board incrementalization which, you know, I'm not there, so I don't really know, but it just strikes me logically that when you start doing across the board changes every time you do this, then I think it's really hard to credibly say you are having little or no impact to what you're delivering, because that doesn't make sense in the context of a school system that has, quote, no fat or waste. So that's just, you know, there's to me some dissonance there. I also, and you raise a really important point, and I probably have a general question for all of you, which is that if you don't get a budget until early June, and town meeting is on the 23rd, do you think that's sufficient time for you to be able to understand, analyze it, approve it, talk about it with your constituents, so on and so forth? It's an important issue that, frankly, we in the advisory committee are struggling with. They're going to struggle quite severely with. I'm curious about your own thoughts.
Good question.
It's a great question, and you can, the town is in the same. All the town departments are in the same boat as well, as you mentioned, the advisory committee. But I don't have a crystal ball, Cliff. But you are right in pointing out that will be very, very challenging. As I say here, we'll continue our budget planning, as we go. We've done a lot of the work, I think, that sets us up to move quickly. But whether we can get people on board and bought in and understanding the further reductions that are likely in that time frame, it's going to be very, very hard, and maybe but we'll keep working on it. But it's a challenge I think we all face together, right?
So I'd like to, can I speak? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Sharon. I just want to say one quick thing, which is that the other thing that we're doing is, trying to message to people that, we are out of school for 14 weeks. And so learning can't stop. We can't just this is not like a 2-week closure where you can just kind of pick up the pieces on the other side. If we kind of did nothing for 14 weeks, which is not what's happening, obviously, but if we did nothing for 14 weeks and said, we'll just try to teach you a year and a half of stuff next year, that's a non-starter, right? And so I think that's all just the pieces of learning has to continue in some way, shape, or form. And it has to, it has to be reduced, it has to be realistic, it has to be sensitive, but it has to continue. And we need a plan for it to continue, like a real plan for it to continue. That is part of the conversation, just on that piece of it. And then I think there's the second piece of it, which is the, how quickly can we sort of identify some of these, things that we've talked about already, and put them into place. Sharon, go ahead.
So I want to address 3 things. The first thing I want to address is sort of next steps. The second thing I want to address is assumptions. And the third thing I want to address is COVID. With regard to next steps, I don't support this next step slide. I think that what we should be doing is eyeing a public presentation of a revised preliminary balanced budget at Finance Subcommittee meeting on or near May 14th, right? We should have better estimates, I believe, at that point from the town, in order for us to have a meaningful discussion about what a revised preliminary balanced budget looks like. I don't think it is an appropriate use of the school committee's time or of the public's time to be having several hours of debate about a budget that no longer is real, frankly. And so I just want to, I agree with what Cliff is saying. I mean, this has been a very thorough recap of what has been many conversations that have happened in public and in Finance Subcommittee and a school committee about the budget over the last 6 months. It no longer is relevant to the current circumstances. That's really unfortunate. We need to be actually focusing our time on other things, while the district on the back end is trying to take steps towards looking at what a revised balanced budget is going to be in the new fiscal environment. So I think mid-May, it sounded like from the town school partnership discussion that at least a full month's of data that excluded the first 2 weeks of March was going to be needed in order to get a sense of what the economic toll on the town was going to be, and as a result, the schools, and that Mary Ellen was in constant conversation with Melissa about this. So by May 14th, presumably, or perhaps a week afterwards, we should have that information, and we should be able to start moving forward with whatever needs to happen. And if special meetings need to be convened of the school committee in its entirety for executive session purposes or for presentation purposes, or if special meetings of the finance subcommittee need to happen, then I'm sure that that can be arranged. Susan, from a procedural perspective, I think that it would be worthwhile thinking about the fact that that perhaps the finance subcommittee could be invoked as, a delegate of the school committee, in order to expedite conversations around this over the course of the next 3 weeks. Because it's just not going to be feasible for us to have sort of a full jawbone over this, like with the entire school committee at the level of detail that we're going to need in order to make the cuts that we've discussed. So if we can get like kind of first reads on this and do some deep dives on this, in the space of the next, 3 to 4 weeks, then we could probably expedite the process you're talking about, Cliff, on that end. And I think I think that we need to think about being efficient with time. So I want to address some of the assumptions. All that I have to say about this is that, this current budget reflects a number of assumptions that the interim superintendent has been advancing about the nature of our expenditures in various categories for quite some time. The school committee has weighed in, as appropriate in public and in executive session robustly, and has given very clear guidance. Now, ultimately, I'm very aware that that was taken as advisory guidance and not necessarily as directive. I continue to have questions about some of the core assumptions. As Suzanne noted, not replacing teachers who are leaving due to retirement is in fact a form of a cut to actual staffing, to real staffing. And I do think it's going to have an impact on students. I think that a very good reason for not engaging in this budgetary practice around special education, in which you cut back in anticipation of reduced expenditures having to do with specific students, is that you don't know what high need or moderate need students are going to come into the district at any time over the course of the next year, and that strategy could well leave us in a kind of a deficit in the special education budget, and that is a serious consideration. We need to be leaving ourselves room to avoid going into deficit, and I think that Cliff understands, as do others, that isn't a matter of fat, that's just planning. The last thing that I want to address is the issue of COVID. There are significant fiscal implications for the educational strategy that the district is pursuing in the current environment. As of the last presentations that have been made by, I apologize, the head of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and by the governor, it's very clear that there's going to be some sort of an assessment that's implemented in order to determine the quantity of schooling that students have lost as a result of the COVID situation. Students in Cambridge who are receiving an hour of instruction a day will have lost, frankly, probably less than students who are having social emotional check-ins with teachers, twice a week, as many students in the district may or may not be receiving. Sometimes it's once a week. Children who are receiving 3 or more hours of instruction in Boston, regardless of the quality of that instruction or that experience, will also have, frankly, a higher level of access just to academic content on which they will be evaluated. I think we should be very realistic about the fact that our current strategy is going to incur costs on us, possibly as soon as this summer, right? And most certainly going into the next academic year. There is a possibility, right, that, the DESE has indicated that there are going to be forthcoming conversations about how to deal with the COVID educational situation, over the summer, and whether or not they're going to mandate summer school or possibly mandate summer school for students who don't meet whatever their minimum standards for assessments are, which would presumably be associated with grade level expectations. We don't have a budget for summer school, right? And I don't know where we're going to get one, frankly, right now. We also have not, the current theory that's been advanced by the deputy superintendent in charge of the Office of Teaching and Learning is that whatever students don't get now, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to sort of fit like a year and a third worth of education into a year or into an academic year by cutting educational fat. I don't know that we have educational fat in our district. I don't know that there's a lot of fluff in our district. I haven't particularly observed it. We seem to be having, like on a normal day, we seem to have a very academically intensive district. And so I think that, and I also think that one of the things that we're not taking into account is educational regression, not just behavioral regression for children with special needs, but, the actual fact that like with math, if you don't use it, you lose it. And that children who haven't had, a meaningful engagement with math in say, since March could be set back as far back as January, right? And that's all going to require resources and investments on the next year's side in order to come up with, which frankly, I mean, just isn't even being reflected in any conversations that we're having at this time. And if we're not willing to do that, then I think we need to be having like a serious conversation about what the net educational impact is going to be versus like the net cost associated with education, as we move forward over the course of the next 6 months. There isn't currently a plan right now other than try to do more with less next year, plus a third of a year of content, and like, I think that, I question the feasibility of that as an educational strategy, but I really question the feasibility of that as a financial strategy. Because for sure, I believe that the state is going to be imposing, educational, like, sort of compensatory education on all students who are found not to assess at grade level. And I think that from a fiscal perspective, that's something that this committee should be taking really seriously. That's all I have to say on that.
So I just respond on two things. Is thank you for the comments around the next steps. Also hearing that from Cliff. So Mary Ellen and I are happy to work with Susan as the chair to really think through how to spend the time publicly in terms of presenting. So I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of adjusting that. So thank you for that suggestion. In terms of the reserve, Mary Ellen, in terms of special education, Sharon, you talked about how we risk and it's poor planning if we make adjustments year to year based on services that are required. What you may not know is that we do have 2 special education reserves. And Mary Ellen, if you can, in order as a planful way, strategic way to account for costs that do come up through unanticipated costs that do always come up, each year. So that's already built in the budget. Mary Ellen, can you talk more about the special education reserve and how we hold back funds just for those purposes? Well, hey, Mary, I thought Mary Ellen was here, but I'll just speak. So every year we have at least 4 positions.
Ben, can you not hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Well, I was talking, so can everybody, I was not muted. So we have 4 FTE budgeted at the Masters 5 teacher's salary rate, which are available for dealing with sort of late spring, fall school startup for students that may move in or totally unidentified needs, unanticipated needs of a student. And those positions are either additional special education teachers or rarely in the last few years have they been used to be paraprofessionals. Casey's team has done a great job in really reviewing the distribution of the paraprofessionals to support students. And so they have, that's the staffing piece that we have. The other piece we have is $475,000 which is primarily for tuition and transportation and consulting services needs, as they too also become identified. So we may have an unanticipated out-of-district tuition that comes in, and depending on where the tuition budget is, the increment of that cost would be come out of that reserve. So those are two base level budgets we budget for every year. And we made that change probably about 4 years ago, and they've been pretty consistent. Not all of them used all of the years, and it's provided, I think, that leveling and manageable resource for the special ed department.
Okay, so any other questions or things that need to get addressed on this? We're about an hour in the agenda. We have a number of other things. Why don't we move then to the town school partnership update? Ben or Mary Ellen, since we're kind of on that topic anyway. Ben or Mary Ellen, do you want to provide a sense of where we are?
Mary Ellen, can you?
Yeah. So I think as Cliff kind of outlined, is we're very cognizant and aware that the state revenues, as they were projected in January, are making a major shift as we're entering into the spring. So we are still in a holding pattern, kind of waiting for additional information and guidance. I know that we need to probably anticipate, $1 million, $2 million potentially additional reduction. I don't have a final number on that. Melissa Goff and Mel are talking to the various municipal departments and communicating with them that they need to be prepared for anywhere between a 10 and 25% reduction in their departments, which is kind of a lot. So I look at 10 to 25% in our budget, and that's a lot. So Melissa and I have not had a conversation in the last week about this. But as I hear and see information coming out of the state, we usually connect and say, okay, what's the impact? What's the impact? In response to Cliff's comment and Sharon's comment about using the month of May, yes, it's important for my time and focus to be focused on budget for the beginning part of May, to take the list that's been developed through the school committee and the senior leadership team, and really kind of fine tune that and get into the nitty-gritty details of the budget and see how many of those can be realistically reduced, and be able to provide information to the principals and the senior staff on so that they can convert that into what would be the impact to student learning, and how to plan around that, to have a plan around that. Also, we need to look at, during this time, we need to actually very much look at our, you'll hear the word furlough, and furloughing employees. That's been a strategy that districts have used in the past, where you actually furlough employees. You're not firing them. It's not a RIF. It's not a termination. But what it is you have the ability to call them back, as you know that you can call them back. And so that is a strategy that we, senior leadership and the principals, we need to look at, think about, and what that might look like. The environment that we have now, which is interesting, is that we have many school districts in the area all looking at this. So everybody, with the first response and concern will be, oh, we're going to lose teachers. Well, every district is going to be doing this potentially, or every district is going to be laying people off. So I'm not quite sure that, quite sure. Yes, we will lose some people, but I'm not sure we'll have the concern that we would have if we were the only district out of the area, you know, abutting 6 or 8 districts doing this. What furlough does is furlough keeps people with the benefit. Well, the one benefit to the employee is that the furlough piece keeps them active employees, and therefore they have access to health insurance. So that is both the town would be paying their portion of the health insurance for the employee, and the employee would continue to be paying their portion. We would not, the additional pay or their normal annual pay is what they would not be receiving. So it does keep, so just simply, there's probably more conversation to have about that. So that is kind of where and just as OpenGov, I am continuing to work on and get ready. We've had a little bit of a snag in our staffing and getting our staffing list up and live. That hopefully will get itself resolved by the end of next week. And I think me also focusing on getting that tool ready so that, again, everybody has eyes on the budget, everybody has eyes on all the positions, everybody can see, you know, where we are, what our staffing is, looking at our enrollment numbers, and really diving into that detail. The ability for OpenGov to be laying out our entire budget the way it does to all of our internal budget managers and senior staff is unprecedented. It's much easier to use and see than, you know, our paper document, which people don't always read, and doesn't always give them the exact information they need and want to make a good decision or a sound decision. So that's where
Mary Ellen, is there, and maybe somebody from advisory knows as well, but what is the timeline on the town trying to come up with an additional, like kind of a revised revenue projection? I know, Cliff, this was a discussion in the last town school partnership meeting. I'm not sure if anything has happened since then, but I think that would be helpful as well as we try to think about May.
What we heard at the town school partnership meeting was that when the state provided information about hotel and meals tax receipts for the month of April, which they would be doing sometime before the 15th of May, we would be able to extrapolate from that the likely impact on our own receipts. I think it's very important to recognize that whatever cut there is in state aid will be that cut will be smaller by some significant margin than the drop in local receipts from parking meters, from meals taxes, and so forth. Parking meters in March dropped by $200,000 out of the $425,000 or $30,000 that we usually see, and it was only the last 2 weeks of March that things went into a lockdown. You can see that there are a big chunk of money missing, and it's that money that we need to get an understanding of, that amount that we need to get an understanding of in order to put a reasonable revenue projection forward. And then, of course, the question is, well, how long is it going to continue? Because if we lose $400,000 worth of parking meter revenue for each month, how many months is that going to continue for? And we just don't know that. That's purely a guess at this point.
Okay, and do we have a sense of, because I mean, just Mary Ellen, to your point, the difference between looking at $1 million cut and a 10 to 25% cut is there's a lot of room in there for our budget. So I'm trying to get a sense of, do we have any updated sense of the town's timeline on projections, or do we need to re-up that?
I would imagine that so one of the key elements of the revenue projection is where state aid is. So for example, if Chapter 70 gets touched, for example, or reduced, like the Opportunity Act funds get pulled back, that for us, that's 224,000, and we haven't allocated those funds. So those are held, we can take those off, and we don't have any additional expenses that we've had to add because of those funds.
So yeah, I guess I'm asking a slightly different question, which is there are, you know, a half a dozen or a dozen streams, dozen or so streams that matter, right? And so I'm less worried about, I guess I'm less worried about funds that we haven't allocated. I'm more worried about the kind of thing that Mike was talking about. So do we have sort of a sense of when we're going to have the kind of next crack at, yeah, Cliff is raising his hand, yeah.
I just wanted to, suggest that there is some recent history that people can go back and at least begin to thinking about, because in, the 2008 to 2011-12 period, we have information about what happened to state aid to us, at least for us. And this situation is going to be worse than it was back then. At least that's what everyone is suggesting. And if people are trying to at least ballpark right now, that's a really good place to start in terms of trying to understand how we might be impacted. Just look at some recent history.
I think that we'll have a better picture, certainly a better picture, probably the second week in May, which is, I believe, when we wanted to get a town school partnership meeting going again to look at that picture. So that's a partial answer, Susan, to the question. The length of the lockdown remains an open matter, and we may know more then, and we may not.
Okay, yeah, so the short answer is it doesn't sound like there's a new date that we are going to be targeting. It's not, I mean, it sounds like things haven't, right, this is
You're
what we
right,
just said
Susan.
is a little bit
Susan,
of,
there's been no more information since last Friday.
This is where we were, that's fine, this is where we were in the last conversation. I just want to make sure we didn't,
Oh, okay.
there's been no update.
Yes, yeah,
No.
You're right about that.
Okay, well, so I guess, so I think this just kind of comes back to the question of timing, and we just, we need to sort of think a little bit about, once we have, rather than trying to think about this in $200,000 increments, what are kind of some other ways to think about it? So I think that just circles back to the last conversation. All right, is there anything else on this? Because I think the last thing on this, on town school partnership, I mean. Okay. So the other thing that we were going to talk about is the remainder of this year's budget, which again is sort of knitted in. And I think the last thing that we had talked about was, number one, trying to understand what the savings would be as we thought about different pieces of the puzzle that costs we wouldn't be incurring and additional costs that we would be incurring. Mary Ellen, I know you had mentioned the idea of locking down the budget earlier than usual, which would be good to get an update on that. And then any sense of timing as to when we will know more information about what costs we can be avoiding, and given our buildings are closed for whatever it is, 14 weeks, and if there are any additional costs, because I know we've started that process, but there's a lot more there that I think we're waiting for.
Yeah, so there are a number of questions that have come up that we're kind of trying to work through, which have to do with resourcing students in terms of the online classroom process. And we've had, that slowed us down in that we've need to rethink how we deliver, I don't know, workbooks and or science elements where we have butterflies, and how do we do that? And we don't typically ship to people's homes. We don't typically, because those are a fraud alert. So we've had some distribution kind of questions that have popped up. So that's slowed us a little bit. And realizing that teachers are now asking to place orders so that supplies and materials get into students' hands, and that's a new logistics challenge that I certainly wasn't anticipating, and being so the new information or more information will probably, I'm still working on it, and it's not yet complete, and we'll probably another week out to getting kind of where we are with if there are any savings. And the budget is frozen. So the process we have is that Casey and Nicole go through and the requests from faculty and teachers and department heads go through their respective departments so that they are sort of deemed essential. So I can spend time focusing on getting funding and orders and things like that all done.
Okay, so a week from now, I guess the question is, do you feel like the message is clear to people that we need to be more rather than less aggressive on harvesting savings that are not necessary costs?
So I can say, first of all, we'll have the next update for you at the school committee meeting. Okay, have a thorough update on the emergency cost. Okay, I can assure you that the message is clearer and more direct to people and more reinforced to people and repeated more to people than it ever has been since I've been here.
Okay. It's just really hard for me to believe that there is not savings. And I think if to the extent that there aren't, we need to understand very clearly what those incursions are, because so many of the costs are building-based costs. And so I think we're going to have to understand in particular for Q3 and Q4, what isn't getting saved and why, if that makes sense, as opposed to like an opt out. It needs to be an opt in, not opt out. So, okay.
So yes, Susan, I think, yes, I am as concerned as anybody is about what savings we can garner from this. And, as you know, the vast majority of our budget is in personnel, and we've all made at this point up to date, made the agreement that we will continue paying people at full freight. So, there will be, I'm assuming too, that there will be savings. But a lot of those are, already out the.
Right, not the non-personnel ones. We're totally in agreement.
Right.
So not, yeah. Okay. Any questions on this? So it sounds like we're gonna. Well, so Suzanne, maybe, I guess, or Ben, we're docketing this in full school committee.
Well, we always have a COVID-19 update, and this would be part of that update.
Well, but where are we doing this more detailed look at what is it that we are trying? Not only what have we frozen and what are we expecting from that, but like what are we trying to harvest? Like what are we identifying? Not in the 87% of salaries, but the other pieces. Here's what we're targeting to try to harvest, as opposed to like, well, it's in the budget and they can spend it if they want to. You know what I'm saying? Like,
I do. No, what I would say is, we have an hour plus, I think it is, docketed for an update on, on the closure. And I would say, I mean, this is within that update, I'd say. But what we need to get to is, the revised version of the spreadsheet we shared before around, costs associated. And then in addition to that, where we're expecting we are or hoping to harvest savings.
Okay. And I just want to make sure that what we're bringing is all of the non-personnel budget items from Q3 and Q4. We're not just doing like, here are 3 or 4 things we found. We're actually looking at the pieces of our budget that are not personnel. Okay, because it's a very different, bottoms up and top down, you're very different. If you're like, here are the 3 or 4 things on the spreadsheet, that's one thing. But if you start with the corpus and you say, here's all the stuff that we were going to spend not on personnel in Q3 and Q4 and what's happening to it and why it's getting spent or where it's getting harvested, it's just a different camera angle in, and you might get to a different place. Okay. Mm-hmm. I'm surprised we're doing that in full session and not finance committee, but that's really something that you and the chair and vice chair can figure out.
Wait, hold on. I was just trying to be aggressive and getting you the information quickly. If you want to wait till the next finance committee meeting, we can do that too. It's up. You're the chair.
No. Or we can do it before the full school committee. At any rate,
we can't do it before. We cannot do it before.
Okay. Well, so Suzanne, and I will leave this in Julie's hands to sort of figure out how to docket this then.
Okay, we'll talk with Julie and Ben and Mary Ellen.
Okay. Anything else on these pieces? Okay. I do apologize in advance. I have to drop off in 8 minutes, but maybe Suzanne will take the chair over from this. So we've done the town school partnership, we've done the 2020 budget, we've done the 2021 budget. So we're kind of on 4, which is the possible contract modification for transportation vendors, which is it's actually the same conversation that we just follows exactly on the conversation we just had. So why don't we start there?
Let me just, Matt provided, let me pull this up, an update. So we were reporting back an update from his meeting with the other communities with what they're doing with regards to their transportation budget. And his email that's provided in the packet provides you with kind of what the expectations are. So most of the districts are negotiating a reduction and making payment of that reduction with Eastern Bus. So we're only doing this with our contractor, Eastern Bus. And because that's all who we're paying. So I think the question was, there was some concern on part of the committee that 70% was too high. And what were other districts doing? And why would we pay them if we're not receiving any service? I think I sort of captured kind of all the various sentiments. And, you know, Matt and I both agree that, and we put a clause into the agreement that if they do get stimulus funds, that is somehow, that will be returned back to the town, the taxpayer, the Brookline, because they should not be able to double dip, but certainly would encourage them to apply for stimulus funds and have those funds returned back to the town, because those can then get redeployed for other necessary services. So I want to just sort of leave it at that and see if there are any other questions that people have, you know, having with this information, as well as sort of having some time and opportunity to think about the concept from the school committee meeting.
Just one other question from the last conversation while people are thinking about that, Mary Ellen, which is that what is the financial cost if we don't do this and somehow service is not ready to go when we quote unquote need it in the fall? Because it's a little bit hard to, as now that we're not in school for the rest of this year, paying for 14 weeks of bus service, even at a reduced percentage, on the theory that when we need them in September, there might be a disruption. I really want to make sure we understand what is the cost of saying no to this, because the savings of saying no to this are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so I want to make sure that we understand if the savings are that, what's on the other side of the ledger? What is the cost if in fact we say no, everyone else says yes, just as Matt said, and we have to pick up pieces on the other side?
I think the costs are that we as a district run the risk of actually not being able to provide mandated transportation services. You know, we have students that would not be going to their language schools, assigned schools from their district. You'd have a disruption in potentially having to replace students in their sort of home-based district, a home-based school, because they're going to, you know, we have students that are elementary students that are crossing the district to go to our language-based schools. That's kind of our. So those students potentially would have to get reassigned because we would not be able to get them to their language-based school. So that's a disruption, huge disruption in how we operate and are organized, and staffing as well. For the high school, you run into about 120 students or more having a significant challenge actually getting to school. Yes, there is the Chestnut Hill Green Line stop is available, but it is not convenient for many that we actually are transporting. The MBTA bus that's in the neighborhood is not big enough to support 120 students trying to get to and from school. So you have a disruption in transportation. So the impact of that is, again, sort of disruption and stress for students, as well as you're increasing your traffic in and around the high school for students to get to school, from school, increasing traffic around T stations for students to be able to get to and from school. So is there a cost impact? There's a, at this point, I can't calculate what those costs are because you would have to have a significant plan in place. And that would be if for the time it took the bus company to get their drivers back, we have 4 buses. So we are not their largest client by any, or we have 6 buses. Somerville has 3, but we're not their largest client. So I would dare say that we would have some challenges, and let alone the phone calls that that the school committee and others would be getting of parents who don't have a vehicle, can't get their child to school, and the like. So that's what I think about in terms of just a massive disruption of our students, and then our METCO students as well. Although METCO is under, for next year, is not under Eastern Bus. So I would imagine METCO, I wouldn't imagine we would have a disruption with METCO because they're under a new bus company contract.
Is a theory of disruption premised around the notion that they would retaliate against us for not paying for services we're not receiving?
No, the theory is that the drivers are going to go find some other work. So here's the thing. So right now, so there's a couple things about bus drivers. You know, they're going to do, some of them could be doing deliveries and find, you know, hey, I have a job. There's another market I can do for my CDL license. And, you know, I kind of like this. I don't really want to drive kids, you know, school bus anymore. And then you have other drivers who are like, love driving a bus, and they will always be driving a bus. And it doesn't matter what job they pick up between now and then and the next school year, they will always go back to becoming a bus driver because that is something they love to do. We don't know, you know, whether that, you know, what we're going to run into, because it takes 3 months to get it, to actually to actually have a driver, a licensed driver, because they have to go through their CDL, they got to go through a bunch of other testing to becoming a school bus driver. So that's part of why it's so critical to make sure that contracts are renewed in July, or for July 1, and specifically, preferably May or June, is so that bus companies can actually, when there's an expansion of service or additional drivers needed, they know they can get drivers all ready to go and be in their bus seats in September.
What would stop those drivers, though, from just deciding that they prefer whatever alternative they found in the meantime, even if we renew? What would prevent that?
Nothing prevents it, but what it does do is it allows for the bus company to continue to actually, I mean, one would hope the bus company would do this, is that they would continue to recruit for drivers.
So I have a couple of questions on the contract. In the most favored nation, not most favored, in the clauses about no double dipping. Are you confident that the math works in a way that protects us relative to all the other contracts that they have? I mean, do we have our own buses? So I mean, it seems a little fuzzy to me in terms of protection for us, and probably anyone else is doing this, in terms of money coming in that doesn't have to be repaid and how it really gets allocated. So I just would maybe like to talk about that at some point. We don't need to, you know, really do it here. The other question I have is whether or not you've thought about, since they're having these negotiations with everybody, I presume, and different districts, they end up negotiating different reimbursement amounts at this point, whether or not you thought about requesting a most favored nations status, so that if anyone they agree with anyone else to, get less than 70%, that we pay less than 70%. Why should we be paying more than anyone else?
Yeah, so part of what Matt provided in the email is he's actually spent some time with Eastern Bus and going through specifically what are Brookline related costs. So what are the lease costs of the buses? What are the fixed costs that the owner has that's specific to Brookline? What are our drivers? What's the driver percentage of the contract? What the bus percent, like what is he currently paying and what is our fixed cost? So lease payments are a fixed cost, whether you're using the bus or not. Where are his savings that relate to Brookline? Fuel, some insurance is reduced. So he's done that analysis. So the shutdown percentage on the table is that, it's roughly about 63%, Newton's about 61%. Lincoln is about, in their contract, 70 to 75, Dover Sherman's about 61. So those Matt went through, and the other business administrators went through with Eastern Bus and said, okay, what are your fixed costs as they relate to the contract per day cost? What are you paying? And so we've addressed some of that. So that piece around 70%, that is kind of where we have all sort of identified fixed costs that he has to stay in business. So if he's paying the drivers and he needs to produce certified payrolls to prove that he's paying his drivers, because that's really the concern here is we want to keep the drivers paid, keeps them out of the unemployment line, keeps them, the theory is keeps them into, we being available then when we need them. So those efforts were done, to your point about we're really only paying fixed costs to have the company stay in business. In terms of the dollar amount for any kind of stimulus, we don't know what funds really are going to become available for that and what percentages are used. So we would want to make sure that we got those, whatever dollars we paid them, that they got from stimulus, that comes back to us. We get reimbursed that, whether the math works or not.
So here's where I struggle, Mary Ellen. I would rather the bus company furloughs their employees than the school committee furloughs our employees, our teachers and our staff. And so, that's my dilemma. I just can't justify supporting the company's employees when we're having trouble figuring out how to meet our payroll if that is the case. So I'm not sure what you need from us today. Are you looking for a motion to support?
Yes, I think Matt and I are looking for you to support our recommendation that we treat our bus company contractor the same way we are treating our town and school employees, which currently we are paying our town and school employees.
Except they're working for us.
Some are, some aren't.
Well, supposedly they are. So I know, Helen, you have a motion, Helen?
Sorry, I was on mute. A question, what is the total cost, or what would be the total savings of the contract?
Let's see if he has that, hold on.
It's not on here. I'm looking on the. And
it's not in the email. Let me. And
then the second question I have, we are about to approve a new contract with them, correct?
Yes, we already. I think you already have.
If I remember correctly, it was higher than this last contract. I don't want to say substantially, but amount that we weren't happy with. There was only one bid, right?
There's always only one bid, and
that's part of the problem here, that we're paying. There's a monopoly here. And that's part of the problem with having buses available in this fall. But there are other companies that we could engage. I mean, if we had to, if we reneged on their new contract for the fall. Or is there a way of adjusting the new contract for our next year's budget? Well, those are questions I would have.
Okay.
So does someone have a motion for today? Because I don't. So
I would like to know the answer to Helen's question about how much savings would be realized if we do not provide the 70% support level. I'm not suggesting we not provide anything, but I think we should at least know what the numbers are before we make a decision.
So yeah, they're in a previous memo. Sorry, it's from April 8th. The savings for June for 66 shutdown days for 6 buses was roughly about 51,000. What has he got here? 76, roughly about $77,000 would be what would be available for regular ed transportation, and the Medco grant is roughly about $35,000.
It's Mike. I do want to point out with regard to the possible problems of not having bus service available if we don't pay what Eastern Bus is looking for, not having services available in September. It's only in the last year or 2 years that we've supported bus service from South Brookline for the high school students. And at the very worst case, we'd be reverting back to the situation that everybody faced 2 years ago. And so I wonder whether when you look at the disruption, you might step back and say, well, how much disruption can we manage versus how much money we pay? And what's the balance here? Because I think Suzanne's comment about, well, it's one thing to pay, essentially, it's one thing to pay our own staff, but it's really quite different to pay somebody else's staff. That's their shareholders' responsibility, not ours. And I think you should be rethinking this matter, particularly with regard to how much bus service you absolutely and actually need reopening in the fall.
So one of the things I do want to point out is that we would not be going back to, we don't have the capacity to provide what was called or referred to as the courtesy bus. Yeah. So that would not be replacing or coming back. So there would be no service back to South Brookline. That courtesy bus was well oversubscribed, left kids at the side of the road because they exceeded legal capacity of the bus, and was very problematic. So we would not likely go back to that because it's fraught with the same problems we have with the MBTA buses being oversubscribed.
All right, it's a fair comment. Appreciate that. I still think you need to think about the.
Oh, I agree with you.
Manageability of the disruption.
Yeah. So yes, I agree with all points made. That they need to be looked at.
I'm not hearing a motion. I'm not sure that Finance Committee is in a position or wants to make a recommendation at this time.
I'm comfortable with recommending that we don't accept the proposed 70% support. I don't know I don't know if we're ready to make a motion. I don't know if you want to take a straw poll on it, but I don't think that we're in a position to accept it. And I think that with every passing day, we're less in a position to accept it. But if we want to give this more time and discussion, we certainly can.
Other members of the committee?
I agree with Sharon. I'm not inclined to accept it at this time. I'm willing to keep an open mind if we can know what the opportunity cost will. So I really would second Mike Sandman's suggestion of perhaps calculating what would be the cost of finding alternatives if we cannot continue with Eastern in the fall, and then we can compare those two costs. But right now, it seems like we're engaged in a more theoretical conversation without numbers attached. So I can't really feel comfortable making a financial decision without knowing the numbers.
It would be helpful to me as a school committee member to have a differentiation between mandatory transportation and non-mandatory transportation in the context of startup in the fall. Because if we did have to, for example, go to a temporary contractor for a couple of months in order to fill in mandatory services while we reapproached Eastern, and if there was a time delay, say, for example, between September and December, for a subset of the population for whom mandatory transportation services is required, I would like to kind of have a sense of like what that population is and relative to the total population that we're currently providing transportation to.
I just want to one cautionary comment, which is that I think that all the additional analysis is really something that we should understand. If in fact Eastern is a monopoly provider of services, and we do not have a contract with them, and then determine at some point in the fall that we need a contract with them, and they're going to be the only bidder, it puts us at probably a reasonably significant financial risk at that point in time, and that needs to be considered and factored into whatever savings or cost, I should say, we're looking at incurring for this 10 or 14-week period.
That's a good point, but can I just clarify, Mary Ellen, can you just clarify, my understanding is that we did just sign a contract with them, so that would presumably still pertain if they were in business in September, right?
So Matt's joined our call and probably can answer some of the more detailed questions that you're having a little better. So Matt, why don't you take that question, and Helen, if you could repeat yours to Matt, that would be helpful after he answers.
Okay, so they submitted a bid and we didn't get the contract approved within the time of the bid documents. So he hasn't actually signed anything saying he'd still honor his bid past the deadline of when the bid would be awarded. So he's a little frustrated that if we're not going to pay him to stay in business during standby, then he said that he might not honor the bid prices for next year and would want to rebid. And he knows he's the only bidder. So maybe I could get Local Motion to bid. I got them to bid on the Metco buses, and that's why we have two contractors this time instead of one. But there's not a lot of competition or change in the school bus market, and it's been that way for 30, 40 years. I don't mind saying it because it's just my opinion, but I think they collude. There's a old-fashioned gentleman's agreement. You don't bid on my contract, I won't bid on yours, and we'll both be okay. And I think that's what happens a lot. And I know there's plenty of people that share that sentiment. The state just can't prove it, or they would have been able to do something about it by now. But it's really kind of tough to say you have to bid on a job you don't want. It's really hard to compel people to do that. So, that's a concern. The concern about, what's the cost differential, to Cliff's point. Yeah, that's real. Like if he feels he lost the money, he's going to try and make it up over the next number of years in the new contract. And a lot of people are concerned about that for the consistency of their budget hits, which is why most of our neighbors and other school systems that are with them are proceeding to make a partial payment. Medford is going forward, Lincoln is going forward, and most other places believe they're going to get to a yes. And I said that Brookline was sort of undecided and waiting to see. I mean, that was my take from the school committee meeting, because we didn't get a vote or a decision to amend the contract.
Matt, just one question. As we, in terms of making an agreement for this year on a prorated, amount.
Yep.
is that retroactive, or is it going forward from whenever we sign? If we sign an agreement, is it going forward from when we sign? I mean, I guess my question is: are we paying 100% now until the date we sign an agreement, or will we recoup savings?
No, the language in the contract amendment would be for the 66 days. When we drafted it, we didn't know we were going to be closed for the whole school year, but it would be for the prorated for the 66 days for this year, and sunsets and ends with this contract. And there is no language in the next contract for it, or a contract amendment for it. Although I suppose we should have that discussion, but we tried to make it as clear and it's not precedent setting that it would apply to this one situation only, because this is new for everybody. Nobody's ever done this before.
Hey, Matt,
Hi, Helen.
sorry, Helen, I just want to ask Matt the question I asked Mary Ellen before. Are the percentage that we're talking about is 70%, right?
Yes, and the drivers would receive 100% of their wages, because when I last spoke to them, the drivers couldn't get through the unemployment lines and came back to him, and he put them back on the payroll.
The question I had is whether or not that 70% is the lowest percentage that he's getting from any of his clients. In other words, is it like a most favored nations type of approach, or can we get that?
No, it's not the lowest percentage. It's the second lowest. Newton has the lowest. Newton is either 61 or 63%. I could pull up a spreadsheet and look, but they have different costs than we do, and they have a different structure. So, for example, he rents a bus yard in Newton that he says costs him about $20,000 a month. So that's an additional cost they have. Newton also, the way they've changed, they've migrated from half-day kindergarten into full-day kindergarten, so they no longer have midday runs. So they have built in doing late runs into their days, so they pay for more runs and more hours than we do, so their price is higher. But he's factoring some of that out as an additional service, because the goal here is to get the drivers paid for their regular to and from school services. So they're not getting paid for any extra runs, field trips, sports, any other midday or specialty type stuff that happens throughout the year. So it's just the basics of their general job that happens 180 days all year round that they'd be getting paid for. So I guess maybe their late runs don't run every day, but the prices are different, Cliff. So people pay between $365 a day and $550, and we pay $435 because the deadhead miles or the overhead cost to set up shop in each town. Each one's kind of its own. Each one's its own contract, and he's got to cover expenses. And then, as I kind of tongue in cheek say, how many times has he had to wrestle with himself when he's submitting a new price?
Okay, thank you.
Helen, did you have a question?
So, Matt, I think Mary Ellen answered it, but I'd like a confirmation from you. The
Sure.
total cost from the time of the shutdown till June is how much that we would owe them?
How much would we pay them?
Correct.
It was in the memo that I sent. It's right around $120,000. I got to look that up.
Okay. And would they consider lowering, I mean, if we're doing a good faith effort to help them through this time, would they consider lowering their contract for next year, since we haven't signed and they haven't signed?
I can ask.
If we were to do that, so that everybody gets, huh?
Our last conversation wasn't great,
Yeah.
but I can ask.
Maybe also the other question is to see if our backup, our plan B.
I can do that with a straight face. I don't think I'd be really BSing them, because I'm going to say, Chuck, we're looking at reductions in staffing and other services, and I know this, is feeling kind of hard, and nobody wanted to do this. But if we're going to be, I'm going to say, look, if we're laying off staff, possibly across the board from administrators through support staff, that we've got to look at how we can tighten our belt on all of our contracts, you know, for outside services with everybody. So, you know, what do we do here to keep this happening? Because if not, you know, I can't guarantee that we can sustain it throughout the course of the contract. That there wouldn't be, that I'm not coming back to you with some other type of request, because the school committee could direct me elsewhere. That being said, if we can come up with something, we do need to sort of honor that agreement and not try to go back to the well again and again.
In terms of the contract for next year and thereafter, do you have confidence that Eastern would sign off on the contract for next year if they get what they asked for this year? So I don't want us to be in a situation where we provide the 70% and then they don't honor their bid.
We can do them, you know, together. You need to sign both. Here's the contract paper for this year and our bid prices that you bid out for the next 8 years, 3 that are fixed, 5 and that are at our options. And you need to sign that one, and then you need to sign the tentative agreement. And the school committee has indicated they'll sign both and get them back to you, and we'll pay you.
Paul,
I would want to tie one to the other if we go that route.
You would, yeah. Just for peace of mind, I would too.
Paul, you're on mute, Paul.
Now I'm off mute, thank you. Just briefly, Matt, for the coming contract, it sounds like it hasn't been signed yet. Would we be building into that contract scenario where we would have a minimum payment when this comes up again? We may have another shutdown in the fall if the virus comes back. Are we planning on putting that in?
So I really wanted to see how this was going to work the first time, but the kind of wait and see approach, yeah, we're already at the almost C, especially if we start paying. And everybody talks about, is this, could this happen again? There's a pretty good chance it happens in the fall, unfortunately. This pandemic's all about herd immunity. You don't hear it too much, but depends on which expert you hear, about 2/3, 3/4, 80% of the population has antibodies to it, whether that's from a vaccine or from fighting it off. We could go to round 2 unless the virus somehow kills itself off.
Right. So all I'm saying is, I'm just saying, I don't know the answer to that.
I don't think he'd be opposed to it because he wants to stay in business, and so do most of his clients, because of the difficulty it is to start up a transportation company or get somebody else to take over a contract, especially if some of them are struggling to stay in business. They might not be capitalized to get a new contract, and you might be paying a lot more for the new company to start up.
Right. So I would first assume, again, I don't know the right answer here. I'm just talking about negotiations. I would assume that he's going to watch this and he's going to hear all this. So there's not a lot of, secrets here about what you may be negotiating. But right now, let me just finish, Matt. The leverage that you currently have, if we do go and end up paying the discount, that should be required that the current negotiated rate for next year is signed. And if possible, I would build into the contract that should this happen again, there's some minimum agreement so that this isn't a renegotiation each time. That's just what I wanted to suggest.
So I'm with you 100% completely there. And then I guess my question is to the committee in regards to, are you comfortable with 70%, or do you want me to come up with a lower percentage and push back on that for the future contract if we have to have another forced government shutdown where we can't operate?
So I look to David and Sharon. Helen, you're not on the committee, are you? Okay.
I would like to hear Helen's thoughts on this.
I'm very mixed, I must say. Have you talked to Newton?
Newton is going to pay. So I've got them pulled up. So Belmont is in. They expect to pay. I'm waiting to hear back from Bill Ricca. Cambridge expects to pay. Medford has already agreed to pay, voted, signed, and through their town accountant's office. Somerville expects to pay. Newton's percentage was 63%. Let me see. So yeah, they got a follow-up meeting on 4/29. Their comptroller in Newton will support it as long as they have a signed contract amendment and release payment.
Okay. On the basis of that information, I was not aware of sort of the monopolistic environment around busing and the lack of options available to us. I also wasn't aware that we hadn't concluded, apparently due to whatever our own school committee issues, we hadn't already concluded a contract that would enable us to start up in the fall. So I'm uncomfortable about it, but I'll recommend that we pay, you know.
I think
it would be, you know, I mean, it would be great if we could go back and get a lower rate, but it sounds like, I mean, Matt, like you've made this presentation to us at least twice, like if not more. And you've been pretty clear about the fact that you could go back but it wasn't going to make a meaningful difference, you know, in terms of sort of what the cost, whether or not you'd be able to try to get a lower rate.
I think there's a partnership to this that, you know, he may grudgingly agree to a lower rate to get it done. We don't want him too unhappy with the agreement because it can come back on us. We want there to be, people might not be thrilled with it, but we want to be, both parties be genuinely accepting that this is going to work. And when we need to return the service, you know, that we return the service to the same level of consistency and quality that we've had. We don't want to be, as I've said before, the only house on the route that didn't tip.
Helen, did you want?
Yeah, so maybe, I mean, obviously this is a negotiation and we should be doing this in executive session and not here, which is feeling very uncomfortable, but maybe to go back to him with Newton's rate and with you know, a signed contract for next year that would include that same rate for next year. If this were to happen, I could live with that much easier. I think it's hard, you know, when we're looking at the types of cuts that we have coming. Yeah, 7%. I mean, and then you know, we can go from there. Does that feel okay?
Just information. This is the subcommittee, so you need the vote from the whole committee.
Well, I need signatures more so than the vote technically. And the majority of school committee signatures, I think, makes it official.
I think you could tell him that we're meeting on the 30th and you'd like to get this wrapped up and signed on the 30th.
Yeah, I mean, if I send it to him, I'm pretty sure he's going to sign. Like because he's been negotiating with all of us and he knows we're all talking to one another. And
yeah, I would go for the 63% and include it in the next contract, that piece.
So I'm actually the other way on this, where I'm not sure we want to lock ourselves into paying a reduced rate in the event of future lack of services because schools are closed. Because what if we find ourselves in more dire straits next year, for example, if it's prolonged, and now we don't even have it as an option to recoup that money anymore? I think that could be a little dangerous. What I would like to see happen is that we insist that both contracts be signed so that we have next year's contract as well. And that's part of the inducement for us to agree to provide the percentage. But I don't think we want to lock in future dollars for future contingencies that might give us less flexibility. I'm not sure if that's what you were saying, but there was a suggestion that if there is a future school closure, that we would pay at the exact same rate.
No, at the 63% rate is what I was saying.
That's what David, I think you're saying that you don't want us to get locked into any rate because of.
Right, I'd be a bit worried about that, getting locked into a rate in a future that we don't really know much about. I prefer to deal with it situation by situation in terms of the closures.
And then we have the precedent of this, if we agree at a percentage this time, we have that precedent, also the precedent of all the other districts who have agreed as well.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry to drag this conversation out because I know there's other things you need to get to, but one question and one observation. The question relates to the drivers and their inability to get unemployment, which I'm not sure I quite understand. What happens if their employees actually go and get unemployment, and that he's no longer actually paying them? Is there any mechanism for us to, you know, essentially recoup money that we're paying for someone who's essentially no longer there? That's and maybe you're doing that by getting his payroll every week and so on and so forth. That's number one. Number two, just so that people have it in the back of their minds, the difference between 70% and 63%. If I was hearing you correctly, Matt, would be roughly what? $10,000 is what we're talking about, I think. But we should know what that number is so that people don't get overly locked in on a percentage if the dollars really aren't that big here. You know, because you just wouldn't want to lose a deal because you got locked in on a percentage when the dollars are actually not huge. Just putting that out there.
Right, I agree with you, Cliff. I'm less concerned about the 70%. I'm more concerned about making sure we have a contract for next year. So I would really insist that if we are going to provide them the 70%, they need to honor the bid that they made for the next 8 years, even though technically they don't have to anymore, but they need to sign both. And hopefully they would be Eastern would be reasonable and agree to do that. And then for the reasons I stated before, I would not add a provision locking in a percentage for future closures, because I think that gives us less flexibility and we're better off matching up with our peer districts if that becomes an issue again down the road.
Okay, so I think, I mean, I really am aware of people's time. We're over by quite a bit. If there's a motion, we can entertain that. If there's not, I think that we say to Matt, come back to us with what you've got to the whole committee on April 30th, perhaps. I think that's where we are right now.
So I'm prepared to go ahead and make a motion with the caveats I just said of they need to sign both, or they need to honor their bid for the next 8 years, and we will go ahead with the 70%. And the reason I'm somewhat changing my mind on this is based on the additional information we've received. We now know that pretty much all the other towns are doing this as well. We also know what the amount is, and we also know what the risks are if we do not do this. So given that we now know the numbers and hopefully we would be locked in for the next 8 years, I'm more comfortable with it.
Is there a second to that motion?
I don't think you have a quorum of the committee.
Yes, you do.
We have 3.
do.
You do. Okay, sorry.
David, do you mind just rewording it just so I can be clear exactly what it is that you're making a motion?
It will be the 70%, that we will provide 70% of the cost from the contract to Eastern Bus. However, they need to also sign and honor the bid for the 8-year contract extension that would begin in the fall. So that way we are covered for the next 8 years.
Yeah, Matt?
Just a point of clarity on that motion. David, do you want to amend that to say up to 70%? Do you want me to ask for the
70%?
Okay, thank you.
Second.
Okay. We've had lots of discussion. I don't know how I'm voting. I can't decide. David?
Yes.
Sharon?
Yes.
And I vote, I don't know how to vote.
Abstain.
I think I'll abstain. I just have more questions. So it's 201. Does that pass? Who knows?
Well, it still needs to come to full school committee anyway, but at the very least, I'd like to move this along.
Subcommittee. Okay, so the subcommittee, the finance subcommittee passed that recommendation. And we'll bring that forward to the main school committee. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that conversation. The next item is about town meeting article 5 and Article 8. Do we need to discuss that today? We have another 2 months before town meeting.
So you don't, but advisory does have the unpaid bills on its agenda for this evening. Not to say that we couldn't change it also. Mike's on, so he could also comment on that.
Mike left. Mike needed to leave.
Okay, so
so Cliff, do you have my memo from?
I do.
Because I didn't send that along to advisory.
I was copied on everything that Robin sent out.
Okay, great. All right. So the only information I don't have with that memo that just, yes, we can postpone it, but the only information I don't have is the funding source. I'm in debate with the controller about the funding source. So I would like to use the balance of prior year encumbrances that are carried over, and I would have used, that's what I would like to use. He is stating that Brookline's, whatever Brookline is, requires a reduction in the operating budget for FY20. I shared with him, I don't have 50,000 in the operating budget because that would have been my first choice. Any help, assistance on funding source for that would be appreciated. It is a town meeting vote, and town meeting, anyway, so that's the one piece I'm trying to work out with the controller's office is funding source.
Okay, so since I'm going to need to discuss this with people this evening, can we just take a minute and go through and understand why this happened the way it did? Because it seems like this is something that should have been taken care of a while ago.
Sure.
Can I just jump in for a minute? I just want to kind of pull certainly the committee members. I don't know if they have time or not. Could we just do our minute approvals and then go back to this? So could we and go back to number 5 in case people need to leave? So it may be not a whole subcommittee meeting. It may be a discussion, I don't know, between Mary Ellen and Cliff, or anybody else can sit in. Could we do the minutes first? Would that be okay? And then we'll come back.
Yep.
It'll only take a minute, I think, to do minutes. So do I have a motion to approve minutes from April 1st and April 3rd?
So moved.
I'll second. Okay, take a roll call. Yes. David?
Yes.
Sharon?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Okay, thank you for that. So we will go back to the town meeting Article 5, approval of unpaid bills. Do we want to set a time limit on this conversation?
Yes, please.
Let's
keep it as efficient as possible. I am interested in hearing the answer to Cliff's question. I'd actually like a clarification of what is the situation here and what's going on, and what is the nature of the discussion tonight. So if we could move through this as quickly as possible, that would be great.
Let's have a goal of 9:50. That gives us 11 minutes. I'm sure it's not enough, but at least it's a start. Okay, how's that? Okay, who wants to go? Is it Mary Ellen's turn to talk?
Yes.
Go
So
ahead.
let me answer Cliff's question. So unpaid bills occur when you do not have an encumbrance for prior to the ordering of services or the contracting of services, or at the time a contract is signed. So typically a purchase order should be going with a contract to encumber funds as part of the appropriation municipal finance requirements. Is the purchase order functions for the vendor that funds are available for that contract. So in Brookline, upon my arrival and I dealt with this in Lexington when I got there and we fixed it. It took a few years to fix. there's a practice, or appears to be a practice, whereby purchase orders are actually done after invoices are received as opposed to ahead of the ordering. So over the last 5 years, I've been working with the school department staff saying, you don't have the fiscal authority to financially obligate the district. We updated the school committee updated the signature policy in 2016, the end of 2016, because of this, to make it very clear about who could fiscally obligate the district, who could sign contracts. And so we've been working quite a bit on this and getting people educated around it and what they can do and can't do to obtain supplies and services. So this particular item with interns, this particular Simmons intern program, did not have a administrator per se, like overseeing it or in charge of it or hitting their budget. And frankly, quite honestly, it really fell through the cracks because the two administrative support middle management people left their positions. And so history was not, so they were, Simmons for about 2 years was sending invoices to an employee's email that didn't exist, that wasn't receiving them and wasn't employed because they had left the district. And then at Simmons, on Simmons' side, they also had a changeover in employees. So I didn't learn about these two particular, we actually had a number, we had FY 19 and 20. Well, 20 we were fixed and put in contract, but 19, so it was 17, 18, and 19. 19 we were able to pay through prior year encumbrance amounts. But I didn't even know that these invoices had existed until the fall, this past fall. That is also unusual, but part of that's because they had a transition in staff too, and we're catching up on their accounts as well. So it's a little bit unusual in the conversions of all things that could go wrong, went wrong. Frankly, given my experience in Lexington, where I walked in with 500,000 in unpaid bills in the first year and 35,000 the second year after we implemented some controls. I'm actually surprised in Brookline, this is the first time in 5 years we've had an unpaid bill. And right now, the way it's being fixed is that Simmons now knows they need a purchase order and a signed contract, because any of the contracts they gave me were not signed by the district. And I said, you don't have a legal contract with the district, so technically I don't have to pay you. But I appreciate that we received the services of the interns and you paid your interns, and there's a moral obligation to make payment. But you need to know, Simmons College, that you need to have a purchase order and a signed contract before you send any interns. That's your leverage. And that purchase order, if people leave, is your golden ticket to have your invoices paid if something goes awry, because you can present that purchase order. And by the way, at the end of a fiscal year, we should be following up with you and saying, hey, we have an open purchase order for X thousands of dollars. Where's our invoice? And so it creates a dual communication, regardless of who's sitting in a seat functioning in a certain role on either side. So I cleared that up with Simmons as well. And so that, these are the last, I don't anticipate any others, but in terms of this particular case, that's kind of what happened. So I've been spending the fall and winter trying to determine, what legally do I need to do, or can I leverage to not pay the bill? What legally can I leverage in terms of the appropriation process to pay the bills? And so, because the last place anybody wants to go, because I had to do it before, is like the last place you want to go is town meeting to explain why people can't follow instructions. Because that's ultimately what it comes down to, is that, somebody didn't follow instructions, somebody didn't follow up, and, that's ultimately kind of, you don't really want to stand in front of town meeting and have to explain that. That's part of why my messaging around the signature policy is that if you cause an unpaid bill, you're coming to town meeting with me. Because, so from this, and on this piece, I don't have anybody present to actually bring with me to town meeting to explain why they can't follow instructions. So I get to have the pleasure of explaining to town meeting why people didn't follow instructions, or we missed the instructions, and kind of the convoluted piece where, it's rare that we actually have a vendor who has sort of a same transition of employees and is catching up on their invoices that are unpaid. That typically vendors are on top of that stuff, and we would have learned about 17 and 18, for example. So
you're asking your subcommittee to do what, and you're asking advisory obviously needs to approve unpaid bills, as does town meeting. Well, I guess we don't have to approve it, but we will comment on it. And so then is the issue here, you're asking something from your subcommittee, A, but B, also needing to identify where you're coming up with the money, or where the money's coming from?
So the subcommittee, school committee needs to be informed of what this is. The issue that is, there's not really a vote per se that school committee would need to take. However, in Brookline, the requirement is a public hearing on any warrant article the school committee has a position in, of which the school committee would have. So that's the added pleasure that I get in Brookline, is not only do I get to go to town meeting and explain it, I also have a public hearing I have to do. So the school committee needs to vote to schedule and have a public hearing on this article.
Okay, and then so the funding source that you started the conversation with, prior year encumbrances versus reduction in the budget, how is that going to get resolved?
Not quite sure, because I don't know who ultimately really gets to decide in Brookline.
Okay.
Because ultimately it's a town meeting vote, so I don't know who gets to decide. So it's on my list of things I need to talk to Melissa about. And in terms of what the options are, certainly if we have funding in the FY20 budget, as I come into town meeting and finish out kind of what the savings are, the operating budget for the school department is the easiest place to do that from and reduce that. It is. We did that before with the FY18 budget deficit. And so that, I appreciate that, but my concern is if I don't have the 50,000, and then it needs to come from somewhere. So the town needs to be prepared about where that needs to come from. And I want them thinking about it. And yes, we have $100+ million budget, but we also have $100+ million personnel costs and tuition costs and other costs that make up that $100 million. So it's doesn't matter if our budget's $100 million or $100. If we're spending all 100, I don't have 50,000. I don't have 50.
Okay.
So that's my.
Yeah. So it's almost time. So so part of the conversation is which articles do we support and do we have public hearings on? So we're going to need a public hearing on this one, and we'll look at certainly we're going to have one on the budget. So those two are we already noted that.
Suzanne, I would say do those two together at the same day, same time, same.
Okay. Yeah.
They don't need to be split apart, and just keep town meeting items tight and together.
Right.
In terms of the timing, I presume that we would want to have the budget public hearing when we have a budget that reflects the COVID-19 closures rather than the one that was presented today.
Right. Except and it has to be before, of course, annual meeting. So we'll figure that out.
Right.
Okay, so it's 9:50. Any new or old business anybody wants to bring up?
Yes, briefly. So for BFAC, I sent this out to everyone, and only Barbara has responded so far. It's very important that for us to move forward in a structured way in terms of putting together our own school committee priorities based upon the BFAC recommendations and attaching a calendar to them so that we actually tackle each one in an organized fashion. I would like to be able to have the feedback of all the school committee members so I can then report back on that and we can work on putting together that structure.
Yeah, thank
So I
you
just
for doing that.
encourage you all to please respond to that Excel spreadsheet that got sent out.
Perhaps, Robin, you could just send a reminder to everybody but Barbara to fill that out. I would appreciate it. Okay. Okay, hearing no other business, I am going to adjourn this meeting. Thank you all so much for all your time today. I know it was a long time. We had a lot to discuss. Stay well and sane. Thank you. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.